Here on BookTube, we're all familiar with the Booker, the Nobel, the Costa, the Hugo, and the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. But there is another literary prize with an over 20-year history. The winner is decided and broadcast live after a week of intense debate. Past nominees, and these are books that didn't even win, include The Handmaid's Tale, Life of Pi, Generation X, and A Fine Balance. And while there's no monetary prize associated with it, it's certainly good for books. Back in 2008, all 5 books that were shortlisted for the prize saw an increase in sales of over 4,200%. It's the CBC Canada Reads Prize, and it's put on by our national broadcaster here in Canada. For those of you outside of Canada, you probably are familiar with the CBC for programming such as Kim's Convenience and Schitt's Creek, available on Netflix. Now, it's a unique literary prize in that the panelists, minor Canadian celebrities all, get to choose the book that they will defend from a curated long list drawn from Canadian plays, fiction, and poetry. And then each of the panelists will debate the merits of their book, and at the end of each episode, Survivor style, one of the books is voted off the island until the end of the week. 2 books go head-to-head with only one taking the prize of Canada Reads Read of 2020. And that episode is to air Thursday, March 19th. Or at least it was. 2020 is currently getting its ass kicked by COVID-19, and so the event, of course, was canceled, along with every other event out there. When the word came down that the event was canceled, I was obviously pretty sad. I was looking forward to checking it out with Aaron over at the Bibliotherapist, but they sent an email a couple days later to say that they're just going to delay that final episode. Of course, that made me happy. I was a little worried that they were going to go ahead and shoot the final episode without a studio audience. And frankly, that never seems to work. If you've been watching late night television at all, it is a little surreal watching them do their bits without a live studio audience. It tends to ring a little flat without the cheers and applause in the background. Maybe that's just me. But back to Canada Reads. I mean, of course, there are those out there that just sniff at this sort of endeavor. They think that these minor Canadian celebrities have no right to be judging any sort of prize, certainly not one that claims to be the definitive Canadian read. I mean, they're not writers, they're not critics. How dare non-literary folk talk passionately about books to a camera? So clearly, our national broadcaster has been doing BookTube before BookTube was even a thing. This year's cohort is based around the theme as the one book to bring Canada into focus. The 5 nominated books on the shortlist include Samra Habib's We Have Always Been Here, Megan Gale Cole's Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club, Jessie Thistle From the Ashes, Eden Robinson's Son of a Trickster, and Cory Doctorow's Radicalized. And with the COVID-19 cancellation, that means you have that much more time to read the shortlist if you haven't done so already. I mean, while you're self-isolating and social distancing, what better way to pass the time than reading some of these Canadian reads? And so, in no particular order, are my take on the 5 nominated Canada Reads books. First off is Jessie Thistle's memoir, From the Ashes. Jessie Thistle is currently an assistant professor of Métis Studies at York University in Toronto. He is a Governor General Academic Medal winner, as well as a Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Vanier Scholar. So clearly, the man has done very well for himself, but it didn't always start out that way. He grew up completely abandoned to the foster system before he was taken in by his grandparents, where he quickly dropped out of high school and then found himself homeless and addicted on the streets of Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa. Reading this, it's important to know where Jessie ends up because you're pretty certain he's not going to make it out of here. His circumstances are pretty dire. It's this endless cycle of addiction, violence, and crime. He's in and out of flop houses and jail. He will probably die frozen out on the streets, overdosed in some flop house, killed in prison. At best, maybe a gray specter, homeless and haunting the streets of Toronto. Thistle occasionally makes a nod to his Indigenous background, which imbues a bit of magic in his otherwise bleak existence. His writing is direct, and he benefits from a really sharp editor that zips us along from episode to episode. We never linger too long on every tragic bit of his back history, and instead we're propelled forward to what will inevitably be a grisly end. But man, Thistle is one hell of a storyteller, and it's hard not to be taken in by this. I love this book. I wouldn't mind if it took the prize, but regardless of how it shakes out in the final standing, I do hope you check this book out. It is definitely worth the read. I'm a little sad I missed Jesse. He came to town recently to do a reading from his book, so hopefully he will have a chance to return when all this COVID-19 craziness calms down. But in the meantime, do check Jesse Thistle's From the Ashes. Well worth it. Next up is another Indigenous writer, Eden Robinson, with Son of a Trickster. Features a protagonist, Jared, your typical high school burnout with a heart of gold. When Jared's not busy getting drunk or stoned, baking pot cookies, or screwing his girlfriend, he is checking in on elderly Mrs. Jacks across the road, doing her yard work, shoveling her driveway, maybe harvesting her zucchinis. When he's not busy doing that, he's checking in on his dad, his new girlfriend, and their daughter, making sure that they have enough money to make the rent. Meanwhile, Jared has to deal with his somewhat volatile, if not downright crazy mother that he shares a home with, along with a rotating cast of renters and boyfriends. Yes, to say she's volatile is perhaps an understatement. She can go full-on unhinged. There is an episode with an ex-boyfriend where she nail guns his feet to the floor. Granted, he did have it coming. And another episode where she takes her truck, slams it into a boyfriend's pit bull, and then calmly backs up over it again, spraying the nearby snowbank with blood and gristle as she spins the wheel. So she's not exactly Mrs. Cleaver. But there's something up with Jared. I mean, the book is called Son of a Trickster after all. Jared's seeing things, remarkable, scary things that shouldn't be there. And there's this raven that keeps trying to talk to him. I mean, I like this book well enough, and no slag here, but it reads like the first of a YA trilogy. It's like an Indigenous Hunger Games, but no payoff. It's all intros. It's leading up to something. And I'm sure subsequent books are going to be incredible, but this feels like the first 3 episodes of a season-long series arc. It's one of those TV shows that you tell your friends, you just need to stick with it for a little bit. I heard Eden Robinson talk about this book recently and how it grew from being a short story, then into a novella, then a book, and then a brick of a book. A brick so big that it needed to be split up into 3 separate books. And I think it shows with this book because it was never conceived of as a standalone with its own tight narrative arc, and instead is in service to subsequent books. So I guess I liked it well enough, but I'm much more curious to see what happens to Jared in the next book. We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib, another memoir that joins the shortlist. This is the story of a queer Muslim girl born in Lahore, Pakistan to Ahmadi Muslim parents who emigrated to Canada to escape religious persecution. So Samra is 13. She's at home in Canada watching Full House when she finds out that the upstairs renter, a young Pakistani boy working at the nearby 7-Eleven, has arranged to marry her. And at 16, she finds herself a child bride. All this while wrestling with her own queer identity in the face of her faith and the customs of her parents. And Samra shows how she manages this with both grace and fortitude. Later, Samra will travel the world, photographing and interviewing LGBTQ Muslims for a photo project called Just Me and Allah. And there's this beautiful moment where Samra discovers Toronto's Unity Mosque, where she's welcome. She, as a queer woman, is free to pray and practice a faith that clearly means so much to her. And, I mean, this is a faith that, despite all the trials that it has put her through, is still something that brings her comfort and potentially joy. And I think that's kind of cool. Traditionally, the story is strict religious upbringing that is dropped like a hot potato as soon as one ages so that one can realize your own full personal potential. And it's rarely about holding on to that faith and shaping it to work with where you are in your life at that moment and being a source of comfort and celebrating that. This is a book that is certainly going to be important for a lot of people who are wrestling with their sexuality and identity in a face of a faith that might consider them other. And I'm glad a book like this exists out there in the world. But for me, I thought it was the weakest of the bunch. And I know it probably has a lot to do with the fact that I'm a middle-aged, cisgendered dude. Maybe a large part. But I also found Samra Habib's writing to be sort of slippery and evasive. It was one of those books where as soon as I put it down a week later, I couldn't remember a single detail. But again, I'm glad this book exists out there in the world. Next up is Radicalized by Cory Doctorow. It is our first white male author writing about sci-fi set mostly in the United States. So clearly, Doctorow does not have a chance with this prize at all. Radicalized is a collection of 4 short stories. And Dr. O here is doing what sci-fi does best. Speak about our current situation metaphorically. Dr. O is tackling issues around white knighting, DRM, media bubbles, broken medical systems, male rage, and privilege. And these are all issues that are just bubbling under the surface of every news item currently out there, or at least every news item pre-COVID-19, because that is all you're getting in the news cycles right now. But even then, talk about timely. The last short story in the collection is an end-of-the-world scenario. We have Your Uber-Rich Finance Bro, which is essentially a radicalized version of the opportunist dickwads that are hoarding toilet paper and antibacterial wipes. It is this idea of rugged American individualism, of taking what's mine and holding on to it as tight as possible, about going to Germany and looking for exclusive rights to a potential vaccine instead of building community and working together, and how that individualistic attitude is doomed to failure, doomed to a grisly end. And then there's the third story, Radicalized. I could go on about this for a while. Frankly, I think it's a metaphor for Alec Manassian, who took a rented van and drove it into a crowd of people in Toronto some years ago, killing 10, injuring 15. He was incited to rage by his incel group, incel standing for involuntary celibate. These are guys that are railing against the Chads and Stacys, being friend zoned. But the problem with groups like this is it just keeps getting more and more radicalized, more toxic, because those people that find partners or girlfriends just nope out of the group entirely. They don't inject that knowledge into the group or hope into the group. They're gone. And it just gets backfilled with more and more angry and lonely dudes. And this thing just keeps getting more virulent and violent. But you can extend your gaze, and it's talking about online bubbles, media bubbles, and first followers, curated personal spaces, and this sort of tendency for the internet to facilitate these fringe groups like flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, and climate deniers. Anyway, there is a lot to chew on here, and this is like a perfect book for a book club discussion, but for me, it's still total middle-of-the-pack read. Not the worst, but not the best. For me, there's only one choice for number one, and it is one hell of a prickly read. Author Megan Gale Coles in the epigraph plainly writes, "This might hurt a little. Be brave. Lord thunder and Jesus, by this is deadly wicked." That was my poor attempt at Newfie there. Now, given time, starting out, it reads almost regional, short, declarative sentence just hurled at you. It's almost like it's trying to read Newfie, like it's trying to portray a certain type of dialect. Now, for those of you outside of Canada, Newfoundland is our easternmost province, and its denizens are often referred to as Newfies. They're often the butt of jokes. Those type of jokes, every country has them. A typical example is like, why do Newfies not make ice cubes? Because they lost the recipe. Now, I think in large part that has to do with the fact that their dialect or their accent is near indecipherable. It is like taking Cockney, Glasgow, and Brit, throwing it into a blender and spitting it out at 2 times speed.
Don't come over to stay where you at, get on the go, have friggin' all deadly old time all together, come to get some booze, some caribou, whatever on the go, right?
They are some of the best people going, though. But back to the book. This thing starts picking up speed like a boulder rolling down a hill, obliterating everything in its path. If you can get past that disjointed start, the writing is wicked good. I think I'm just a sucker for when poets decide to write a novel. It is Valentine's Day at the Hazel and Upscale Bistro in downtown St. John's, and no one at the restaurant is coming out unscathed this day. It is a Me Too novel that attacks not only the perpetrators, but the bystanders, the facilitators, and those that stay quiet. I mean, Harvey Weinstein may be serving time for his crime, but there is an entire network of individuals that should be feeling the heavy weight of what he has done and should be considering how they've remained complicit for letting it go on for as long as it did. Okay, heavy stuff, but have I mentioned the absolutely incredible writing? I mean, this is the writing that got her nominated to the shortlist for the Giller Prize. Now, I'm not sad that she lost out to fellow poet Ian Williams and his book, The Reproductions, but still, this easily could have taken that prize. Here, she faced off against Margaret Atwood's The Testaments on the Long List, as well as fellow Newfie and my authorial bae, Michael Crummey's The Innocents on the shortlist. Here at CBC Canada Reads, she is facing off against YA, white guy sci-fi, and a 20-something memoir. I mean, unfair, but still. Okay. She should totally take the title of Canada Reads this year, but if she doesn't, I will settle for more of you going out and picking up this book. Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club by Megan Gale Coles is well worth the read, and I do hope you pick it up. Okay, So there you have it. Well, that's it. No idea when they're going to be hosting Canada Reads 2020. I mean, I'm currently working from home for 2 weeks, but that could quickly turn into 2 months to all bets are off until the fall. And it's an especially anxious time for a lot of people right now with questions of job security, contending with the kids suddenly at home with no school. Maybe you have a vacation that's been canceled, or you're just simply cooped up inside with not a lot of stimulation. It can be really anxiety-inducing, and I hope you're doing well. Arguably, it's a great time to start reading. Lots of free time. But together, I think we'll all get through this, and I hope you're doing well, and I hope you stay well. So we'll talk again soon, I promise.